Hello and welcome to So Easy Sewing's Granite City Block of the Month Finishing Class. We will gather fabrics 2, 9, 11, and 13. From fabric 2, we will cut 14 5-inch squares. From fabric 9, we will cut 14 5-inch by 2.5-inch rectangles. And 14 6.5-inch by 2.5-inch rectangles. From fabric 11, we will cut 80 half-square triangles and 10 4.5-inch strips for our borders. Now the instructions are going to tell you to cut out 36 3.5-inch squares from fabric 9, 72 3.5-inch squares from fabric 11, and 76 3.5-inch squares from fabric 13. That is a lot of cutting, sewing, and pressing. Or we can sew strips. We will sew together 3.5-inch strips of fabrics 9, 11, and 13, as well as strips of only 11 and 13. When we press our strips, we want to press our seams all in one direction for the first set and all in the opposite direction on the next. So for our first set, we are going to press all of our seams towards fabric 13 or our lighter fabric. For our next set, we will press all of our seams toward our darker fabric or fabric 9. You will do the same when pressing our strips with just fabrics 11 and 13. One strip will be pressed toward the light fabric, the next strip will be pressed towards the dark fabric. This will ensure that our seams are already pressed in opposite directions so that when sewing our rows together, they will fit together nicely. First, we want to trim off our selvage edge so that we have a nice straight edge to work with. Next, we will cut our strips into 3.5-inch sections. We will do the same with our strips of just fabrics 11 and 13. We will trim our selvage edge first and then cut into 3.5-inch sections. You will have to seam rip a couple of the squares later on. However, it does save a lot of time over cutting and sewing individual squares. Before we begin piecing, I recommend that you lay your rows out so that you get an idea of the gradation of fabric 9 throughout your quilt. We will begin by piecing our 5.5-inch square and 5.5-inch rectangle. We will press our seams towards our darker fabric 9. Next, we will sew our 6.5-inch rectangle to our block. It can go on either side. Again, we will press our seams towards our darker fabric 9. When sewing our half square triangles to our rows, I found that the easiest way to make sure that they line up is to make sure the flat edge of our triangles are along the top edge of our rows. When pressing the seams for our half square triangles, we will press the seams in whichever direction the rest of the seams are pressed in that row. And just like they should, our seams here alternate in different directions. This row we will press towards our half square triangle. And our next row will go the opposite direction away from our half square triangle. When it comes to sewing our rows, we want to make sure to line up our seams, nestle them together, and pin them in place. We will sew our rows together the same way for all 4 types of border pieces. When pressing these rows, I found that it is easiest to press up towards the longer row. This presses the tab at the point of the half square triangle underneath the row above it. This eliminates the need to trim our tabs from these blocks and makes it so that we have a nice straight edge when piecing. Next, we will piece our 6.5-inch block to one of our rows. When pressing this, we want to match it to the bottom row of this block. If our seams are pressed forward towards our half square triangle, we will press our seams in that direction. If they are pressed away from our half square triangle, we will press away from it. Next, we will line up our second set of rows to the bottom of our block. We will align and nestle our seams together and pin them in place. Again, we're going to want to press our seams up towards our longer rows. You're going to create 6 block sets in this direction and 8 block sets in the opposite direction. For 2 of our corners, we will create block set D as follows. We will sew our rows together the same way we did for our previous blocks. We will then take our 2 block rows and sew them together down the long center, making sure to line up our seams and pin them in place. We will press this block the same way we did with our previous one, pressing the seams towards the longer rows. This will ensure that the tabs at the points of our half square triangles are hidden under the longer rows. For the center seam, you can press it to either side or press it open. It is completely your preference. And finally, we will create 2 block E's for our other 2 corners. We will follow the same steps for sewing our rows together. This one will just have a couple more rows. And just like before, we're going to press our seams towards our longer center rows. Now to assemble our quilt. You can either align your blocks in any pattern you choose or align them according to the diagram provided in your pattern. We will sew diagonally across our quilt in rows with a border block of A or B on either end of our rows. And of course, when pressing the seams of our rows, we want to press each row in an opposite direction so that when we sew them together, they will nestle and lay flat. To create our border pieces, we will simply sew together our 4.5-inch strips. I sewed together 3 strips, sewed them to the side of the quilt, and then trimmed the excess to use for the other strips. You want to sew both side borders on, trim them to size, then sew your top borders on, and then trim to size. Unfortunately, because I am making a king-size version of this quilt, there was not enough room for the camera to stand in front of the machine while maneuvering the quilt to add the borders. Once you've sewed on your borders and trimmed your excess, you're done. Congratulations, you've finished Sew Easy Sewing's Granite City Block of the Month.